There it is. See that? I wanted that to show you the Hellespont we mentioned is that very small sliver of water between the Black Sea there and into the Aegean, but into the Mediterranean eventually. But that gets you. That's what separates. Just that little body of water separates Europe from Asia, right there. Greece from Asia Minor. And so go ahead and run us up. No, that's Babylon. That's fine. Leave it there for just a second. We've looked at two kingdoms so far as we look at our introductory material to Daniel. These four major empires or kingdoms with which we have to deal in this book. The Babylonian, of course, and the monarch that you want to remember, really two from that. You want to remember Nebuchadnezzar, who is the one that took the children of Israel into captivity. And certainly we will read about him extensively in the book of Daniel. The other monarch, of course, that you'll recall is Belshazzar, who was apparently vice-regent or viceroy with his father, Nabonidus, and was the last Babylonian ruler when the Medes and Persians defeated them and took Babylon in 539 BC. So, Babylon, of course, a couple of things that it did. Babylonian captivity cured the Jews from what? Idolatry. Yeah, when they came back from Babylonian captivity, they were never idolaters again. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have their spiritual problems. And certainly by the time Christ arrived on the scene, they were fairly spiritually bankrupt, even though ostensibly they were worshipers of the one true and living God. But they were no longer idolaters. Number two, Babylonian captivity most probably contributed synagogue development as far as the fullness of time, Galatians 4:4, because we know that the synagogue played a significant role in the spread of Christianity in the first century. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Let's go up to the... All right, next one. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. The next kingdom that we covered, and we've moved on from there, of course, is the Medes and Persians from 539 to 333 BC. And really, as far as the Medes and Persians are concerned, the two monarchs, two rulers that you really want to remember are, of course, Cyrus the Great, who God called by name some 150 years before he was born and 200 years before he defeated the Babylonians. And it was this Cyrus the Great that allowed the children of Israel, of course when I say allowed, it was through God's providence, allowed the children of Israel to return to their homeland. What is significant about that? Why was it so important that they go home? What's the big deal about that? Absolutely. Where was the Christ going to be born? He wasn't going to be born in Ecbatana or Susa or any place like that. He was going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea, Bethlehem Ephrathah. And so they had to go back home. And so Cyrus is the one that commanded that and, of course, allowed them to begin rebuilding the temple and so forth. And so Cyrus is extremely important. And, of course, you also remember the law of the Medes and Persians, which gave stability to legal codes at that time, because really up until that time, before the Medes and Persians, if you were king, if you were Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel tells us this, if you were Nebuchadnezzar, what limitations did you have on your power? None. If you got mad at Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and felt like throwing them in a fiery furnace, guess what? You got thrown in a fiery furnace. That's just the way it was. I mean, if you decided you wanted to be merciful and let somebody live, that was fine too. The monarchs of the Medes and Persians couldn't just do that. And so that's extremely important. And of course, you want to remember Cyrus. Another one that you probably want to remember from the Medes and Persians would be Xerxes or Ahasuerus, most probably of the book of Esther. And he allowed the Jews to defend themselves when Haman tried to wipe them out. So go ahead to the next slide. That gets us to Alexander the Great. The Greek Empire, you see, stretches all the way from Macedonia to India. And even, let's see, Cyrene. You remember Simon of Cyrene? What did he do? He carried the cross of Christ, right? And so all the way over here to the Indus and Oxus rivers into India. And so we were talking about the greatness of Alexander when we left off last week, and we looked at several passages even from Daniel that indicate his greatness, Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11. And when I say Alexander was great, of course I'm not talking about from a spiritual perspective. I'm talking about from a human, secular, historical perspective. He was great. What he accomplished by the time he died at the age of 33 was unbelievable. And well, you can see what he accomplished by the time he died at the age of 33. And he, of course, led, even before he was commander, led one of his father's forces in battle. He was cunning, he was enterprising, he was ruthless, but could be capable of compassion. And we'll see that as we go through this study. I think one thing that makes him intriguing and universally admired is that whenever anyone dies at the top of their game, it makes an impression on us, does it not? I mean, let's think about it. People are enamored with John F. Kennedy, right? And one reason they're enamored with him is because not only was he the youngest man at the time elected president, but he was assassinated in office while he was popular. And so your memory of him is indelibly fixed at that point. I mean, let's say he had lived another 40 years and died when he was 80 years old. I don't know what his legacy would have been. I don't know how people would have felt about him, but it's just different. You know, Elvis died when he was 42. Now, I don't know if he was at the top of his game like he was in the 50s and 60s, but nevertheless, he had made a huge comeback and he was extremely popular. And so what's indelibly blazed on your mind is Elvis at 42. Now, he would be 85 today if he was alive. It's just hard to think of Elvis at 85 in a karate gi singing Hunka Hunka Burning Love. It just really is. But you can see that, you know, as a younger man. And so Alexander, of course, died when he was very young and really when he had accomplished so much. So, in the spring of 334, he crosses the Hellespont into Asia Minor, and he starts winning battle after battle. Now, keep in mind, he's moving rapidly, but he's not having to fight everybody. I mean, a lot of places are just, you know, they just surrender, say, hey, we don't want any of that. And so, for instance, Sardis and Ephesus and others in Asia Minor just surrendered. By the spring of 333, after some other skirmishes, he reached the town of Gordian, where we mentioned he supposedly loosed the Gordian knot and was proclaimed master of Asia. In the fall of 333, he met Darius III on the field of battle for the first time near Cilicia, or near the town of Issus in Cilicia. Alexander at the time had an army of 35,000. He lost 450 men. The Persians lost anywhere from 15,000 to 50,000 men out of a 90,000 man army. But here's what's interesting. Darius fled the battlefield and abandoned his wife, mother, daughters, and sons. He just left. And Alexander treated them as royalty, and in fact, one historian said that Darius' mother, Sisigambus, went on to become quite fond of Alexander and reportedly killed herself by refusing food and drink after hearing of his death. Following Issus, he moves down the Mediterranean coast. Let me try this one. Starts coming down this way, takes Damascus, and enters Phoenicia. You recall the Phoenicians, great traders of the day. Tyre and Sidon are their cities. And so he starts moving down the coast. And most of Phoenicia gives in to him without a fight except for Tyre. And so he besieges Tyre for 7 months. Now let's go over to Ezekiel chapter 29. Look what God says to Ezekiel in verse 18 of chapter 29. Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, caused his army to labor strenuously against Tyre. Every head was made bald and every shoulder rubbed raw, yet neither he nor his army received wages from Tyre for the labor which they expended on it. Therefore, says the Lord God, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, and he'll take away her wealth, and that'll be his wages. So God says, look, Nebuchadnezzar worked hard when he besieged Tyre, but he didn't get any wages from it. So what happened when Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre? How long did Nebuchadnezzar besiege Tyre? Anybody know? 13 years. 13 years. And what did Nebuchadnezzar accomplish when he attacked Tyre? Anybody know? That's right. He destroyed the mainland. And Tyre had a city on the mainland, and then just maybe a half mile or so off the coast, there was an island, and they had built a city on the island. So when Nebuchadnezzar besieges them, well, they head out to their island city, and eventually he conquers the city on the land, but he doesn't take the island city, which of course they figured, well, nobody had ever done that. So let's look back at Ezekiel chapter 26. Look at this proclamation against Tyre. The word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel and said, Tyre's gloating over Jerusalem. Verse 3, therefore thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will cause many nations to come up against you. Well, they did, many, Nebuchadnezzar being one of them. And they shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers. Now notice, I will also scrape her dust from her and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for spreading of nets in the midst of the sea, for I have spoken, says the Lord God. It shall become plunder for the nations. Also her daughter villages which are in the field shall be slain by the sword. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. Now, verse 7, he says, I'm going to bring Nebuchadnezzar. And he's going to slay them and heap up a siege mound, direct his battering rams against your walls, and so forth. With the hoofs of his horses, verse 11, he will trample all your streets. But look at verse 12. He changes from the pronoun he, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, to they. They will plunder your riches and pillage your merchandise. They will break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses. They will lay your stones, your timber. Now wait a minute. They will lay your stones, your timber, and your soil in the midst of the water. I will put an end to the sound of your songs, and the sound of your harp shall be heard no more. I will make you like the top of a rock. You shall be a place for spreading of nets, and you shall never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, says the Lord God. Now, don't get confused. He says Nebuchadnezzar is going to do this, this, and this. He. Then he says they are going to plunder you, and they're going to take your timber, your stones, and your soil, and do what with them? Throw them into the water. So Nebuchadnezzar besieges Tyre for 13 years. You know how long it took Alexander to defeat the island city of Tyre? 7 months. Because he did something that they thought nobody would ever think of doing, and what did he do? He took all the ruins of the old city that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed and threw them in the water and built a causeway out to the island. He also used Navy to do that, help him with that as well. And so he takes Tyre in 7 months. While he's there, he sends out emissaries throughout the region asking for troops. He wants to increase the size of his army. Jaddua, the Jewish high priest, refused Alexander's request because he said, we've made an oath to Darius III, the king of Persia, and I cannot break that oath and send you help. How do you think Alexander took that? Not well. And basically he said something along these lines, I will show him, I will teach all men to whom they must keep their oaths. He wasn't talking about Darius. And that scared the Jewish high priest because basically what Alexander was saying is, when I get through with Tyre, I'm going to come to Jerusalem and destroy it. And there was nothing to stop him from doing that. In fact, that would have been the next logical step for him on his way east. Let's go over to Zechariah chapter 9. Remember, Zechariah prophesied, encouraged the Jews to rebuild the temple. Has a lot of messianic prophecy in Zechariah. Beginning in verse 1. The burden of the word of the Lord against the land of Hadrach and Damascus, its resting place for the eyes of men and all the tribes of Israel on the Lord, also against Hamath which borders on it, and against Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. For Tyre built herself a tower, heaped up silver like the dust, and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will cast her out. He will destroy her power in the sea, and she will be devoured by fire. Ashkelon shall see it and fear. Well, Gaza also shall be very sorrowful. After Alexander defeats Tyre in 7 months, he moves on to Gaza, or Gaza, however you want to pronounce it, on the coast, of course. One of those old Philistine cities that we recall. There's Gaza, not too far from Jerusalem. How long does it take him to take Gaza? 2 months. It takes him 2 months to take Gaza. And Ekron, for he dried up her expectation. The king shall perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. A mixed race shall settle in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. I will take away the blood from his mouth and the abomination from between his teeth. But he who remains, even he shall be for our God, and shall be like a leader in Judah, and Ekron like a Jebusite. Now notice verse 8. He's going to judge Gaza and these other Philistine cities. But in verse 8 he says, I will camp around my house because of the army, because of him who passes by and him who returns. No more shall an oppressor pass through them, for now I have seen with my eyes. God says, I'm going to camp around my house because of the army. Whose army? Who's coming? Alexander's coming. He says, because of this army that's passing by, I'm going to camp around my house. So Alexander's on his way, and the Jewish high priest is scared, and he tells the people they need to sacrifice to God, they need to pray to God, they need to ask for help. And according to Josephus, and this is where all this comes from, and there are some modern historians and scholars that don't believe a word of this story. I know Josephus can embellish things. But let me tell you something. There's absolutely no reason for Alexander not to destroy Jerusalem without intervention from God. So the priest supposedly has a dream where God tells him that things are going to be okay and that he and the rest of the priests should put on their priestly garments and meet Alexander as he approaches the city. And so they did, and they go out to meet him as he draws near the city. And here's what Josephus says. And when the Phoenicians and Chaldeans that followed him, Alexander, thought they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, they knew Alexander was upset. The very reverse of it happened, for Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, his turban, having the golden plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself, talking about Alexander, and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and encompass him about, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass that when all the others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I did not adore him, but that God who hath honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that, having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it, and remembering that vision and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius, and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. So, Alexander, what's your deal here? Why are you treating the high priest this way? He says, I had a dream back when I was in Macedon. And in my dream, I saw all this happening. And I was told that I was going to be given the world and Asia and conquer the Persians. And I believe that's going to happen now. So they bring him into the city. He goes into the temple. They help him to offer sacrifices to God. And he treats them fabulously. And then, supposedly, according to Josephus, they take the book of Daniel and show him where Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, and he supposed that himself was the person intended. And you know what? He was right. And so he asked what he could do for them, what favors they wanted, and the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and pay no tribute on the 7th year, and allow Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their laws and customs also. And he promised that's all good and fine. And he said, look, if anybody wants to enlist, you can come with me. And so many of them said, hey, yeah, we'll enlist and we'll be part of your army. So somebody says, well, that all sounds a little... Keep in mind that who is God's chosen people at this point in history? The Jews still are. We're not in the New Testament yet. And God is still using them to bring the Messiah into the world. And so I like what Brother Dan says in his material. He said 2 questions need to be asked. First of all, did God really speak to the high priest and Alexander? And he says, well, why wouldn't he? I don't know that he did or didn't, but could he have? Something extraordinary happened to keep Alexander from destroying Jerusalem. And I know this, when we read the book of Daniel, and as we study the book of Daniel, we're going to see that God spoke to a heathen monarch named Nebuchadnezzar on 2 separate occasions. He spoke to him directly from heaven, and he spoke to him in a dream. So could he have spoken to Alexander in a dream? Sure, he could have. And of course God wasn't going to let Jerusalem be destroyed, because he brought his people back there because of the seed line, and so that Christ could be brought into the world there. Alexander and the Greeks are all part of the fullness of time. He leaves Jerusalem near the end of 332 and enters Egypt in 331. Unopposed and greeted as a Savior. While he's there, he founds the city of Alexandria, makes it a trade center, invites Jews to settle there in a separate quarter where they can keep their own customs, takes Cyrene, as we've already shown you, on the Mediterranean coast. Then in the spring of 331, he marches on with 40,000 troops and 7,000 horsemen to Gaugamela, east of the Tigris and north of Nineveh. Over here. Babylon, so Nineveh's got to be up here somewhere. Where is Nineveh? Oh, here it is. There's the battle right there. Okay? Gaugamela, where he meets Darius. He defeats the Persians in 331, but Darius III escapes him. Babylon and Susa surrender to him without a battle. Captures some other cities, gaining all the wealth back that Xerxes had taken from Greece. He missed Darius III by 8 days at Ecbatana. There's Ecbatana right there. But on entering Bactria, I saw Bactria on there. Where's Bactria? Right. Where's the word? Oh, there it is. Bactria. That is modern day what? Anybody want to take a wild guess? You've been following the news. Afghanistan. Alexander enters Bactria, Afghanistan, and he finds Darius dead on the side of the road. His troops had killed him. And so he takes the Caspian region and Bactria. He then advances all the way to the Indus and Oxus rivers, way over here, and is ready to keep going until what happens? We're told in history. Yeah, a soldier said, look, don't you think we've gone far enough? We're tired. We've had enough. So they wouldn't go any further. So he goes back to Babylon where he lives and dies at the age of 33. And I don't really know. He dies in the summer of 323 BC. And, you know, some say he died of alcoholism. Some say after a drunken orgy. Some say they don't, natural causes. They don't know why he died. Richard Curry would say he died of a broken heart because there was no more worlds to conquer, and he may be right. But I know what Daniel says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, what? The great horn was broken. So, Alexander's gone. With no succession, is unexpected, unforeseen. Supposedly, somebody asked him one time who he was leaving his kingdom to, and he responded, to the strongest. So at least 7 of his generals make claim to his kingdom. And that doesn't include the unborn son of Roxana, the Bactrian princess, who was murdered by Cassander in 311. But there's 7 of these guys that make claim to his kingdom. Ptolemy, son of Lagos. All these are either subordinate generals or bodyguards of Alexander. Eumenes, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Antigonus, Antipater, and Cassander. And they basically fight for 20 years. Perdiccas is made a regent at first, but he's slain. And so they basically fight down to around 301 BC. You recall, according to Daniel chapter 7, 8, and 11, that Alexander's kingdom was basically divided up among how many? According to Daniel, as we see. We've already read that. 4. I said 7. Well, they fight for about 20 years, and it ends up getting it down to those 4 that the Bible says would get it. Antipater died in 319, Eumenes in 318, Antigonus in 301 at the Battle of Ipsus while fighting against Lysimachus and Seleucus. And so now we're down to the 4. When it comes to the 4, and they all get pieces of the pie here. And in fact, you can see up here, it tells you So the Seleucids are in green. The Ptolemies are in whatever that color is. Antigonus is over here. I guess he gets Macedonia. Or Lysimachus gets the purple. Thrace. But for our purposes in the book of Daniel, there's only two that are important. Who are they? Seleucus and who? And the Ptolemies. Ptolemies here, Seleucus here. Ptolemy the first Soter and Seleucus. And really the Seleucids are the most important to us, even more so than the Ptolemies. But as far as waging influence over Palestine, it's between those two. And for the first 100 years, from about 300 to 200 or so, Palestine is under Ptolemaic rule. And the reason that happened is this. Seleucus was supposed to get Cilicia, that's what the historians call this area here, which includes Palestine and Syria. You see, he's got all that. But as soon as they divided it up, Ptolemy the first Soter decided he wanted Palestine, so he took it. Supposedly, Seleucus said this about his friend. He would not take action for the present for friendship's sake, but later on he would consider the best way of dealing with a friend who grasped more than his share. So what happens is, over the next 100 years, they fight 5 major wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Now, what do you see that's in between them? Who do you think is going to get the worst of this? 2 warring factions, and you're sitting where? You're sitting in the middle. But the Ptolemies start out with it, and for that 100 years, actually, they treat the Jews pretty good. One Ptolemy ruler, we're not going to go through all these rulers because, frankly, we're going to have to in chapter 11. Look at Daniel chapter 11. I'm not going to go through all this history because we're going to have to do it again anyway. But look at Daniel chapter 11. But I'm going to give you an overview. Begin in verse 5. From verse 5 to verse 40. We're not going to read it, but notice how it starts out. The king of the south shall become strong, and he shall gain power, and join forces, blah, 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 shall go to the king of the north. And on it goes. Verse 9, the king of the north shall come to the king of the south. Verse 11, the king of the south shall be moved with rage, and he'll go to the king of the north. On it goes from Daniel chapter 11 for about 35 or 40 verses. The king of the south is going to do this, and the king of the north is going to do that. Who are they talking about? Who's the Bible talking about? The Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And they're not talking about the same king in all of these. I mean, there's going to be a series of actions taken by various Ptolemy and Seleucid rulers that we're going to have to go through as they battle over this particular piece of land. And so we're not going to do it now. You might want to remember Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Soter ruled from 323 to 285 BC. Ptolemy II Philadelphus ruled from 285 to 247. Does anybody know what significant event took place between 285 and 247 BC in Egypt, in Alexandria, while this particular Ptolemy was ruling? Anybody know what particular event took place between 285 BC and 247? The Greek translation of the Old Testament. Septuagint was translated. This is the same translation that Jesus used and quoted from when he lived on earth. The LXX would have been done during this time. The Ptolemies, of course, lasted all the way down to 31 BC to Cleopatra. She was defeated, her and Antony, by Octavian. The Seleucids began with Seleucus I, Nicator. And one man you're going to want to remember, because we're going to have to talk about him extensively, is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled from 175 to 163 BC. because he's talked about significantly in the book of Daniel. In about 201, Antiochus III found Ptolemy's forces weak, and he defeats the Ptolemy commander Scopas at Mount Hermon, and the Seleucids then take Palestine from 198 to 142 BC. And so the Ptolemies had it for 100 years. Now the Seleucids have it. Antiochus III called himself the Great King. Hannibal, the great general of Carthage, had been defeated by the Romans. He actually fled to Antioch for protection from Antiochus III. Antiochus invaded Greece and lost a war with Rome, and therefore they took his son, Antiochus IV, as a hostage and made him pay penalties for about 12 years. The Romans did. Ultimately, one of his sons took his place, but eventually this Antiochus IV Epiphanes came to the throne in 175, and we got to talk about him a little bit before we get out of this. You understand that wherever Alexander went, he Hellenized the world in which he found himself. What do I mean by that? What did he do? What did Alexander do wherever he went? All over this part of the world. He spread Greek culture. He established Greek cities, spread the Greek language, their customs. It's called Hellenization. And not only did he do that, but the Seleucids did that as well. And some were more aggressive about it than others. Now, up until Antiochus IV, Antiochus III, they did some Hellenization, but generally peacefully. But guess who's the only nation that successfully resisted Hellenization in that whole area? Who would you think? The Jews. Now, some of them wanted to be Hellenized. Some of them liked Greek culture. And the Jews were divided into two groups. Those who wanted to be Greek, and then the Hasidim, or the pious ones. And Antiochus took it to a violent level and attempted to stamp out Judaism, but in the end he was unsuccessful. Brother Turner talks a lot in his commentary about the Jews that wanted to be Greek. They even built a gym in Jerusalem. And guess what they did in that gymnasium? How would they exercise and compete? Naked, like the Greeks. And in fact, it says that the Jews who competed naked in the gymnasium were ashamed of their circumcision and attempted to hide it. How you do that, I do not know. And frankly, do not want to discuss in this class. But were ashamed to be circumcised because they wanted to be like the Greeks. So they actually had a gym. Antiochus IV promoted himself as Epiphanes, the manifest one. The Jews had another name for him, Epiphanies, which means madman. Daniel prophesied about him in Daniel chapter 8, verse 9 as the little horn. And he made a number of excursions into Egypt, attempting to defeat the Ptolemies. He would stop along the way in Palestine to exert a pro-Hellenistic influence on the Jews, most of the time peacefully. But one time went badly. And this is one of those events in history that you just don't forget when you read about it. So let me tell you what the Roman historian Livy said about what happened. Antiochus IV set out through the Arabian desert, and after being welcomed by the inhabitants of Memphis and by the rest of the Egyptians, partly because of sympathy with his cause and partly through fear, he came to Alexandria by a series of short marches. After he had crossed the river of Elysus, a place 4 miles from Alexandria, he was met by the Roman commissioners. And so Antiochus, in about 167 BC, marches into Egypt, and he's somewhere around Memphis. Not Memphis, Tennessee. And he's met by a Roman envoy by the name of Popilius Linnaeus. And he extends out his right hand to Popilius, whereupon Popilius hands him a resolution from the Senate, Roman Senate, that tells him that he is to show no hostility to Rome's ally Egypt, and that at some point he's got to go home. Well, Antiochus says, well, you know, let me get my advisors and my friends together and we'll talk about this. And I like what the Roman historian says, that Popilius, in keeping with his general acerbity of temper, drew a circle. Now, understand the picture. They're talking, and the king of the Seleucids, he's a king now, over all that area, says, well, I'll think about it, and I'll talk to my advisors. And the Roman envoy takes his stick and walks around him and draws a circle and says, make up your mind before you get out of that circle. And he says, before you move out of this circle, give me an answer to report to the Senate. The king hesitated for a moment, astounded by the violence of the command, and then replied, I shall do what the Senate decrees. And then Popilius gave him his hand as an ally and friend. Well, Antiochus is humbled and extremely frustrated. So what do you think he does to take out his frustration? Where's he got to go back through to go home? He decides to take his frustration out on Jerusalem. Offers a pig on the altar at the temple. Tears up books of the law. Abolishes Jewish sacrifices. Mothers are forbidden to circumcise their sons. The infants that are killed and hung around their mothers' necks. The altar is profaned. First Maccabees refers to the abomination of desolation. And people are said, the Jews are told, you need to start sacrificing to Zeus. That's why Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, is talked about extensively in the book of Daniel. And we're going to pick up with Daniel chapter 11. You might want to read verses 21 through 36 before next week. But look at verse 21, and I'm going to leave you with this. And in his place shall arise a vile person. The New American Standard refers to him as despicable. God is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes IV. So we'll finish up with the Greeks, the Hasmonean dynasty of the Jews, and we'll get into the Roman Empire.